So welcome to Survival of a Nation. I should say welcome to the finale of Survival of a Nation. Tonight we will be doing lesson 6, A Nation That Dwells Alone, Israel's relation with the family of nations. And I'm very excited to do this lesson for a few reasons. First of all, because I think when it comes to Israel, this is probably one of the most practical lessons. In other words, of course, we should talk about what our perspective is on Israel and our theology and our theories about Israel, etc. But we also want to try to understand what is my little role. You know, what role do I in my little city in Pasadena play when it comes to Israel? And of course, one of the things that we suffer in terms of this is anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism or whatever you want to call them. We're going to dive right into that today. So that's what this final lesson is about. I'm also excited about this because really the entire lesson today, I have to tell you, and I know this is a bad introduction when you're about to give a 90-minute lesson, but the entire lesson today is not going to do justice to the topic that we're going to discuss today, which means essentially anti-Israel bias and anti-Semitism as a whole deserves its own course. And this is amazing because, as it so happens, the next course that we're going to be giving is about anti-Semitism. And that's not my choice, by the way. I didn't set this up. God set this up because the next course is a brand new course out of the JLI, the Jewish Learning Institute, that puts together these courses, and we will be starting that course on October 25th. And I sent out an email about it yesterday, the first email, because I wanted everybody to have that link and be able to register for it already. It's not a 6-week course, it's a 4-week course, but you can register for that whenever you're ready. It begins October 25th. Will again be 4 Mondays, and every Monday we'll do 1 o'clock on Zoom, 7:30 in person. And at 7:30 there will be dinner served each night if you'd like to join for that one. And that's again October 25th, which means after all the holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, etc. Before we get started, we should start with a lesson video, because as always we're going to use a moment in the Six-Day War to springboard this lesson. And the moment that we're going to talk about today is going to be one of the factors which led to the Six-Day War, which is the war over water. So let me just reshare this with the sound. There we go.
By the way, each time you check that, I hear the sound before you go to check it.
I know, but when you're hearing the sound beforehand, you're only hearing it because the speakers are going back into the microphone, which Lon, as the only audio guy on this, that's bad sound. But if we feed it directly through Zoom, it should be better. Either way, please turn your attention to the video screens.
Water is the elixir of life. But water allocation can be a deadly affair. In the Middle East, where temperaments mirror the soaring temperatures and prejudices flow freely, the price of water is sometimes paid in blood. After the State of Israel declared independence in 1948, its leaders put their heads together to develop a water plan that would provide desperately needed fluid for drinking and irrigation purposes. Israel came up with the National Water Carrier Project, a plan to draw water from the Kinneret Lake in its north through a technically challenging network of canals, tunnels, and pipes covering a diversity of terrain and elevations, all the way down Israel's west coast to its populated center and to its parched agricultural south. The Kinneret, also known as the Sea of Galilee, is a picturesque lake in Israel's north, ringed with beaches, meadows, and mountains. It is approximately 35 miles in circumference and 150 feet at its deepest point. It held enough water to meet the demands of Israel's expanding population for decades. However, this wonderful freshwater asset is inherently fragile. It is fed mainly by the waters of the Jordan River, which originates in the gushing springs and tributaries of mountainous Lebanon and Syria. 2 rivers are especially critical to the aqua that courses down the Jordan Valley before flowing into Lake Kinneret, the Hasbani in Lebanon and the Banias in Syria. Without these 2 rivers, the Jordan's waters would drop dramatically. The Kinneret's water level would also drop, and its remaining freshwater would be irreversibly salinized, by the salt springs sitting on its bed. While Israel simply wanted to have a drink, their plan drew the ire of her neighbors. Having failed to eradicate Israel in the 1948 War of Independence, the Arab world swore to at least limit her growth and economic success. Israel's water project threatened to severely undermine that goal. When Israel began construction on the national water carrier in July of 1953, the war over water was set in motion. Hostilities emerged in 3 stages that served as stepping stones towards a full-scale Arab-Israeli conflict. As Israel's tractors bit into soil north of the Kinneret, Syrian artillery units roared into action, bombarding the Israeli construction site. Syria demanded that the United Nations intervene against Israel. The Security Council wished to uphold Israel's right to resume work on its water project, but the Soviets vetoed the resolution. Israel modified its plan, moved its construction site further from Syria's border, and its engineers went back to work. But the dispute was just warming up. Syria and Jordan then colluded to divert the Yarmouk River. The Yarmouk would be forced to flow away from Israel and instead supplement the Jordanians' irrigation needs. United States President Eisenhower dispatched Ambassador Eric Johnston to resolve the situation. The result was the 1955 Johnston Plan, a brave attempt at coexistence and water sharing that Israel embraced and that the Arab League unofficially resolved to abide by, at least temporarily. The waves of war were thereby stilled for most of a decade. In 1964, Israel completed the national water carrier. It was 81 miles in length and had taken years to build at the cost of hundreds of millions of Israeli lira. But it was worth every lira. The carrier was capable of funneling an astonishing 19 million gallons of water per hour, an achievement far too great for Israel's Arab neighbors to swallow. The Arab League hastily convened in Cairo. Desperate to wreck Israel's water resource, they devised a reckless plan. The Headwater Diversion Plan called for the reduction of the water carrier's capacity by 35% by diverting its headwaters, both the Hasbani in Lebanon and the Banyas in Syria, into the Yarmouk River, deep in Jordanian territory. At the same time, the Arab League clarified that this was not simply a war about liquid, but rather liquidation. Since the existence of Israel is a danger that threatens the Arab nation, the diversion of the Jordan waters by it multiplies the dangers to Arab existence. Accordingly, the Arab states have to prepare so that if necessary results are not achieved, collective Arab military preparations will constitute the ultimate practical means for the final liquidation of Israel. Israel warned that the Headwater Diversion Plan would infringe on its sovereign rights. In other words, it would be considered an act of war. The Arabs, however, were not opposed to a war. They launched their project, and the skirmishes began. In 1965, there were 3 high-profile border clashes. The Syrian military attacked Israeli farmers and army patrols, and Israel responded by sending tanks and artillery to destroy the Arab heavy earth-moving machines that were working on the diversion plan. The Arab states eventually abandoned their project, but the war over water inspired them to plot a war of extermination against Israel. Hostilities between Israel and Syria spiraled over the next 2 years, with Syria using the Golan Heights to rain artillery upon unprotected Israeli farms and villages in the plains below. In the first quarter of 1967, there were over 270 border incidents of sabotage and attack directed against Israel. A view of the war to come came on April 7th, when Syria fired at Israeli farmers. Israel responded with artillery, and the fight escalated. Israel sent planes against Syrian positions and villages, and in an ensuing aerial dogfight, Israel downed 6 Syrian fighter jets and chased the remainder all the way back to Damascus. Ariel Sharon later observed, "People generally regard June 5, 1967, as the day the Six-Day War began. That is the official date. But in reality, it started 2.5 years earlier, on the day Israel decided to act against the diversion of the Jordan River. In fact, it could be argued that the war began as soon as a parched Israel politely asked the Kinneret for a drink.
As parched and as much of a drought as we find that Israel finds itself in, we often find the same thing to be true when it comes to looking for a voice in support of Israel. This notion of Israel being a land that doesn't have much water was not a surprise to our ancestors. In fact, even before Joshua entered the land of Israel, crossed the Jordan into the land of Israel with the Jewish people, Moses warned the Jewish people in the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. Joanne, can you please read for us text 1? Just don't forget to unmute yourself. I muted everyone during the video like that there wouldn't be any background noise. Text 1 is on page 220. And welcome, Stephanie. Good to have you with us.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay. The land into which you are entering to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have left. There you planted your seed and watered your fields by bringing water from the Nile by foot, like a vegetable garden. But the land you are crossing, the Jordan River, the land you are crossing to possess is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven.
Okay, so the land of Egypt was famously a land that had a very, very good irrigation system. The Nile River flows through the center of the land, and then the Egyptians we read about this in the Bible, the Egyptians had built these little channels that come out from the Nile River as irrigation systems, what the Torah calls Yeorim, that go through the fields or at least brought the water close to the fields like that they can then draw the water and water their fields. In this regard, Israel seems to be extremely lacking. There is no water to be had in the entire land, even though really we could say that Israel does hold an advantage, because when it does rain in Israel, the topography is such that the water actually goes directly to the fields. I guess the water kind of lands on mountains and comes down the fields immediately. Whereas in Egypt, they would still need to draw the water, and it's only because of these channels that the water actually comes to them. The problem that Israel has is that if it doesn't rain, they're in trouble. That's what led to everything we just saw in the video. The question I'd like to start off today with is, why would God choose to give us a land, right? And we've discussed in past lessons that God didn't just choose to give us the land, but he created the entire world with the intention of giving us the land. And the one land that he chooses to give us has this massive Achilles heel. I mean, it's flowing with milk and honey. It's got all the 7 fruits and all the different things that it's blessed with, but it's got this one big Achilles heel, which is water, for which, as we see, we have to be dependent not only on other nations, but on redirecting water and creating this whole structure, etc. By the way, this led to a lot of innovation on Israel's part, right? The drip irrigation system, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which I believe we have at least an iteration of some sort of it outside in the Chabad gardens here that were just beautifully put out in one of the last steps in the construction of the mikveh. And let me remind everybody that this coming Sunday at 3:00 p.m., you all received it in the mail, I think. If you didn't, it was only an oversight. You are invited to the mikveh dedication. You'll be opening the mikveh. There will be tours of the mikveh, and you'll be able to see the entire thing in its completion. This is a $1.3 million building and 6 years in the making. So please join us to see it. And it finally makes the Jewish community complete, because we finally have a mikveh here in Pasadena. So please join us for that. But my question is, so what I was saying was,
do we need reservations?
No reservations necessary. Just join us, please. 3:00 p.m. on Sunday. What I do want to say is, though, that like I was pointing out here about the drip irrigation system, is that this, right, instead of it being a sprinkler that sprinkles out, it's kind of embedded within the mulch and topsoil. This little thing which drips water out and goes directly to the roots of the fields. And that's an innovation that Israel has innovated, and it came out of necessity, like many innovations, right? The question on the table here today, and one that I really like to start off with, is, why would God give us a land, tell us this is the perfect land, flowing with milk and honey, etc., and yet it's missing one major element. In other words, it's not self-sufficient when it comes to one major thing. Okay? So that's the first question to start off with. Now, to use as a segue from this conversation to the next conversation, because we're going to get back to this question all the way at the end of the class. So to segue now into the main topic of today's class, then we'll come back and we'll see how it all connects. Just as Israel often finds itself parched just to have a drink of water, so too does Israel often find it difficult to find even one lone voice in support of Israel. Now, I want to make something very, very clear. Today, we are going to be talking about anti-Israel bias that there is. We're going to talk about the way it is in the UN. We're going to talk about the way it is in the media, in the international media. We'll talk about the way it is by random people on the street, okay? Random people who approach me in Ralph's, right? To give a little throwback to that story. And we're going to talk more about that interaction and specifically what my analysis is based on this lesson in another 20, 30 minutes. However, I want to make something absolutely clear. We are not saying in any way, shape, or form in today's lesson that criticism of Israel is illegitimate. In fact, healthy criticism, loving criticism of Israel is actually encouraged. We do it all the time. In fact, we did it in lesson 4 and lesson 5. We criticized Israel for many of the decisions that Israel itself has made, right? The problem is, and by the way, in general, in that regard, Israelis themselves, not just Jews, but Israelis themselves usually lead the charge in anti-Israel criticism, right? In taking stances against the current government or current policies, etc. What I'd like to take some time today to talk against is unfair and unobjective, or I'm not sure how you would say it, inobjective or subjective criticism of Israel. So two elements. In order for criticism to be healthy, in order for criticism to come from a good place, it has to be A, fair, and B, objective. Okay, and I'd like to take a moment to define those two for you. Okay, in order for something to be fair, and how we'll notice if something is not fair. Okay, so number one, in order for something to be fair, it has to come from a place that looks to critique all countries and all people based on a consistent standard. Okay, so if we see someone, whether it's a body of nations or if it's a particular newspaper or a particular human being that says, I'm criticizing Israel, and that's not coming from an anti-Zionist or an anti-Semitic or an anti-Jewish perspective, we have to immediately see that you can't just single Israel out. You have to be willing to denounce or speak out against other nations that are doing possibly even more horrific things than anything you claim that is your healthy criticism of Israel, right? It has to be fair, right? There has to be a consistent standard that you hold everyone to in an equal light. You can't say Jews have to be held to a higher standard because of X, Y, and Z. You have to hold everyone to that standard. And number two is objective, which means to be objective means to not have a narrative and then spin your story and then bring facts to support your narrative. In other words, spin a story and then bring facts to support that narrative. The facts have to be facts. You have to start with the facts and then follow them wherever they lead. And wherever they lead, that is the narrative that's created. And unfortunately, as we're going to see very often, that's not the case. You can see this summarized for you on page 221, fear and objective. That's two of the things that we're going to hold any critic of Israel to, because otherwise it's not considered just fair criticism of Israel. It's not considered healthy criticism of Israel. It rather would be considered Jew hatred, Israel hatred, whatever way that is, and whether those two are distinguishable, we'll address right after this. Okay, so it would probably be very boring and would take an exhaustive amount of time for me to summarize every single act of anti-Israel bias that we've seen in the UN, particularly. But also specifically in the international media. So instead, we have a great video, and this is the last one today, I promise. I know you guys like to study and to hear from me, but this video will do great justice to just talking about anti-Israel bias that we have found in the United Nations.
On the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah Wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians.
The regime has also authorized the extrajudicial killings of thousands of detainees. We now believe that the Syrian regime has installed a crematorium in the Sednaya prison complex, which could dispose of detainees' remains with little evidence.
Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2012 through 2015, the Assembly adopted 97 resolutions criticizing various countries. 83 of these targeted Israel. That's 86% of all country-specific resolutions. A closer look at the Assembly's score sheet reveals that year after year, less than a quarter of its measures censure countries other than Israel. And while 3/4 of this global forum's ridden rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 35 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years before the Palestinian Liberation Organization even nominally forswore terrorism, the Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part in its deliberations. This was the first time that anyone who was neither a government representative nor a head of a quasi-state was granted such a privilege. The following year, the Assembly awarded the PLO permanent representative status. A few months later, the UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to 2013, Israel was condemned in no less than 45 Human Rights Council resolutions. That is almost half, 45.9% of all country-specific resolutions passed by the Council. This same obsession with censoring Israel is found in all branches of the United Nations. At the UN's World Health Organization Annual Assembly in Geneva in 2005, the body passed but a single resolution against a specific country. That's right, Israel. Israel was charged with violating Palestinian health rights. Similarly, at the International Labor Organization's annual conference in Geneva in 2005, the organization carried only one major country-specific report on its annual agenda. No prizes for guessing its identity. A lengthy document charged Israel with violating the rights of Palestinian workers. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment at the UN.
There are some bias against the Israeli people and government.
In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
A disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
One of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, no? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not there's other really bad happening. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all of the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
As sad as it is, the UN has largely been a tool of those acting against Israel over the history of the UN's existence. I don't think this is news to anybody here, but hopefully that short film collage kind of puts things in perspective. Similarly, there are many who believe that the preponderance of international media outlets that skew every single headline, right, and that filter every single article so that it biases against Israel is also a huge showing of anti-Israel bias that exists in the world. Over here, I want to talk specifically about the fairness of the coverage. Okay, let's just take a look at some headlines here. You know what? Before we take a look at the headlines, let's read text 2A because I think this is very, very telling. Text 2A is written by an author who served as a reporter in the Jerusalem bureau of the AP, right, the Associated Press, which filters articles out to all sorts of news outlets. And he's writing based on his experiences between 2006 and 2011. All right, Lon, excuse me, can I ask you to read text 2A?
Sure.
Then we'll take a look at some headlines.
Very disturbing, that documentary we just saw.
Yes, tell me about it.
Okay.
But nowhere near as disturbing as the reality that plays itself out on the ground every single day in the UN. But to see it all lumped together, there is disturbing. Go ahead.
Is there anything left to say about Israel and Gaza? Newspapers this summer have been full of little else. Television viewers see heaps of rubble, plumes of smoke in their sleep. A representative article from the recent issue of the New Yorker described the summer's events by dedicating one sentence each to the horrors in Nigeria and Ukraine, 4 sentences to the crazed genocide of ISIS, and the rest of the article, 30 sentences to Israel and Gaza. Imagine that. Israeli actions are analyzed and criticized, and every flaw in Israeli society is aggressively reported. In one 7-week period from November 18th to December 16th, 2011, we started to count the stories coming out of our bureau on the various moral failings of Israeli society. I counted 27 separate articles, on average of a story every 2 days. In a very conservative estimate, the 7-week tally was higher than the total number of significantly critical stories about the Palestinian government and society, including the totalitarian Islamists of Hamas that our bureau had published in the preceding 3 years. The Hamas Charter, for example, calls not just for Israel's destruction, but for the murder of Jews and blames Jews for engineering the French and Russian revolutions and both world wars. The charter was never mentioned in print when I was at AP, though Hamas won a Palestinian national election and had become one of the region's most important players. To draw the link with this summer's events, an observer might think Hamas's decision in recent years to construct a military infrastructure beneath Gaza's civilian infrastructure would be deemed newsworthy, if only because of what it meant about the way the next conflict would be fought and the cost to innocent people. But that is not the case. The Hamas replacements were not important in themselves and were therefore ignored. What was important was the Israeli decision to attack.
Hold on, Lon, I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment. First of all, I neglect to mention, but I think it's quite obvious if you look at the source here, but this is from an article in the Tablet magazine called An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth. The date of the article is August 26, 2014. So that's the end of the summer of 2014. For those of you that remember, in summer of 2014, there was an operation going on called Operation Protective Edge in the Gaza Strip. Israel was in the Gaza Strip, et cetera, without getting into all the details of that conflict at the time. So that's when they talk about the summer's events, that's what they're talking about. The reason I'm interrupting you right now, Lon, is because I want to talk specifically about this, because we have some hindsight that we can talk, we have some more benefit now, and now that 2020 has passed, March 2020, which also had its own conflict, which I want to talk about. The author is mentioning that he was working at AP at the time, right? So he's working at AP from 2006 to 2011. He wasn't working at AP during 2014, but he says, wouldn't you think, right, that in the summer of 2014, they should address the fact that in Hamas's charter, and he goes on with all these things, he says, wouldn't you think that since Hamas has recently gained power, they should mention the fact that Hamas has made a decision to construct a military infrastructure beneath Gaza's civilian infrastructure, right? Wouldn't you think that would be deemed newsworthy? What I want to add to that is, I just want to remind everybody that in the recent conflict, one of the biggest things that Israel was blamed for was for knocking down a building that guess who had headquarters in? The AP, the very same news institution, which he's labeling as biased, and he's pointing out their clear bias. And you're going to see some very concerning things. If you found that disturbing, Lon, before, and the end of this article is going to be very disturbing. But hold on a second. What he's pointing out is that they're neglecting to even report on it, on the fact that Hamas is building terrorist cells and infrastructure beneath news buildings. And then when fast forward to 2020, when Israel does launch an attack on it, takes down that building, they're like, oh, not 2020, 2021, right? March of 2021. When Israel does take down that building, because that's the obvious thing you need to do if you try to wipe out the terrorists in the Gaza Strip, they're then blamed for how could you take out a news building and be so inhumane, etc. And I just want to point out the hypocrisy that we're seeing here. But finish off at least the article, the part of the article that's being quoted here. And by the way, I want to encourage you all, it's found in the additional readings, the entire article, which is titled An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth, is found in the additional readings in your textbook at the back. I'd like to encourage you to read through the entire thing because we're not going to do the whole thing. It's way too long. But go ahead, finish off, Lon.
Okay.
There has been much discussion.
There has been much discussion recently of Hamas attempts to intimidate reporters. Any veteran of the press corps here knows The intimidation is real.
We're getting some feedback from Stephanie, who I think one of her connections wasn't good, so she's logging in. Okay, go ahead. That should be better. Go ahead.
All right. Any veteran of the press here knows about the intimidation is real. And I saw it in action myself as an editor on the AP news desk. During the 2008 and the 2009 Gaza fighting, I personally erased a key detail: that Hamas fighters were dressed as civilians and being counted as civilians in the death toll because of a threat to our reporter in Gaza. The policy was then and remains not to inform leaders that the story is censored unless the censorship is Israeli. Earlier this month, the AP's Jerusalem news editor reported and submitted a story on Hamas intimidation. The story was shunted into deep freeze by his superiors and has not been published. Delightful.
Anyways, we'll stop here and we'll skip text 2b because it's more of the same. You're welcome to read it in your time. I have some more things that I want to add in later, so we're going to need some more time. But I wanted to take some time to analyze. Let's look for fairness and objectivity in some newspaper headlines. Will you join me? Even though I think we see this all the time, right? So, this is just dovetailing off this last article, right? What's mentioned and what's not mentioned, right? An alarming number of civilian deaths is always mentioned. The fact that Hamas militants addressed as civilians are not mentioned, right? This is considered fair coverage? Of course not. Israel's decision to attack Gaza, always mentioned. Hamas military infrastructure beneath Gaza, if that's what they're attacking, obviously never mentioned. Israeli censorship of the news, always mentioned. Hamas censorship of the news, not mentioned, right? So we see here the lack of fairness. By the way, you can do the same thing with objectivity. It's never called an Israeli-Arab conflict, even though that's always what it is, right? Or maybe even a Jewish-Arab conflict, and some could even say it's like a Jewish-Muslim conflict. It's almost always somehow called an Israeli-Palestinian conflict recently in the news. Very recently, I mean the past decade or so, when in fact that's already spinning a narrative. We mentioned this in our Land for Peace discussion, that sometimes the words you use already begin to spin a narrative. That's not objectivity. That's not using facts and following them wherever they lead. Rather, and you could read more about this in text 2b, rather that's having a narrative and then choosing facts, right? Cherry picking facts to fit that. But let's take a look at some headlines. We can all do this in our own. By the way, the 5 headlines we have here, lest you think that they cherry pick the right ones to fit the narrative that we're making here in this lesson. You can do this on your own. I hate to tell it to you, but there will probably be more attention, and Israel will probably be in the news again. And the next time you take a look, just go to your favorite news outlet. Okay, almost all of them will be biased in this way, right? 3 Palestinians killed as daily violence grinds on. What's the subcaption? You can't see it here because they cropped the picture a little bit, but the subcaption is: Israeli policemen stand next to dead bodies at the scene of where 3 Palestinians who were shot dead by Israeli police after carrying out what Israeli police spokesman said was a shooting and stabbing attack. So we only get to the shooting and stabbing attack in the subcaption way later. But the headline is 3 Palestinians killed as daily violence grinds on. The fact that they attempted a shooting and stabbing attack, and which is only mentioned as alleged, of course, right? Of course, unbiased news, right? That's where we start to see the bias, right? And I'd like to point something out. We're not burying our heads in the sand here. There is no such thing as unbiased reporting of news. All news reporting is biased. News reporting about Black Lives Matter, news reporting about whichever president or politics is playing out at that moment is always biased. But there is a regular amount of bias because that's human tendency, right? That people tend to give their skewed views of the matter, right? And then there's agenda-driven, purposely created bias that you see clearly playing out, right? Let's take a look at the rest of these headlines here quickly. Another alleged Palestinian stabber shot by Israeli cops, right? I mean, the whole headline is talking about how the Palestinian is shot by Israeli cops. The word stabber is stuck in there just to pretend as if we're not being biased, right? I mean, in what situation is such a thing? In any time in the U.S. that a perp is being apprehended, it's always stabber is caught by, right? Perpetrator, perp is caught, or whatever it is, right? It always starts off with what he did wrong and then follows up with what's happening to him as a result. Where are we here? Israeli, from the AP, Israeli police shoot man in East Jerusalem. You see that one? right? Take a look what's going on. Israeli police are shooting somebody in East Jerusalem. It's terrible, right? You take a look at the sub caption. Israeli police say they shot a man whose car slammed into a crowded train stop in East Jerusalem. But why would you mention that in the headline, right? So the bias is real. And I don't even think we need to do the question on page 227. Are these headlines fair and objective? I think it's very apparent and very clear that there is bias. The real question is why, okay? And this is going to lead us into a conversation on anti-Semitism. And we're not going to go through on page 228, figure 6.1, which is notable incidents of anti-Jewish prejudice and violence throughout history. But I think the purpose of that is to show us that anti-Semitism is not something new. It's not something that started with anti-Israel. And part of the question, which we're going to get to shortly, is anti-Israel sentiment essentially just anti-Semitism being disguised in a new form? Okay, but today, right now, we're going to start off with a conversation about anti-Semitism. And the conversation on anti-Semitism cannot start without quoting the Haggadah. Heidi, if you can, please, text 3. You hold on, Heidi, you're still muted from the video. My apologies. That's okay. There you go.
Okay, text 3. It is not one individual alone who has risen against us to destroy us, but in every generation they rise against us to destroy us.
That's directly from the Haggadah, which is hundreds of years old, not thousands of years old. No, thousands, right? Which was compiled during the Talmudic era. So that's over 2,000 years old. Jews have been saying this for years. Now, let me just clarify. This doesn't mean that in every generation, everyone rises up against us, but there's always someone. Anti-Semitism has never disappeared from throughout the Jewish people. Unfortunately, Pharaoh was not the first one. Pharaoh was only the first one, and he was not the last one to hate the Jewish people and to act on it. I think it's fair to say that anti-Semitism has waxed and waned over Jewish history. There have been better times and worse times, but that it has always been there. Historically, there have been times, for instance, when anti-Semitism was low. Think the golden age of Spanish Jewry, right? But then that was ended by the Spanish Inquisition and the infamous Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion from Spain and Portugal, etc., and the Jews needed to flee and being dispersed all over the world, right? So anti-Semitism is low, and then it rises and it's high again. Continue to today, it exists just as it did in every generation. Again, perhaps lower, and perhaps maybe 5 years ago we would have said it was much lower, and now we're seeing it rise again, which is why on the agenda is a new course, right? In October is a new course on anti-Semitism, because now it's back in the news, and it's back, and it's worrying Jews again. It's something that we need to learn how to deal with again. In fact, even countries that had very few Jews living there throughout history, such as Japan, for instance, I don't know how many of you know this, but anti-Semitism has even been documented there. There's an article which you can take a look at. I think it's, you know what, I'll send out a link to it. I don't know if it's in the additional readings, but I'll send out a link to it in the follow-up email, which an article called Japanese Attitudes Towards Jews by Jennifer Golub. I'll quote one little quote from that article, because Japan is a place that never really had a huge surge of Jews living there, right? It was never really a Jew central at any point in our history. But a quote from the paper goes as follows, by Jennifer Golub, goes as follows: anti-Semitism in Japan is one of the greatest anomalies in the history of that prejudice. A country containing no more than 1,000 Jews, one that is neither a Christian nor Muslim society, should not, logically speaking, have anti-Semitism. And yet it did. They figured it out. They arrived at the same conclusion that many other non-Jews arrived at. I'm sure I could ask you all, how many of you have been personally affected by anti-Semitism? Could we do a raise of hands if you've been personally affected by anti-Semitism? Okay. Joanne raises, is that 2 hands or is that I don't know? Okay. On page 231, here's the real question. I think more important than whether anti-Semitism is alive today, is not alive today, to what degree it's alive today. I think more important is why. Why are the Jews, right? Because if we're going to try to get to the Israel question, we want to first get to the Jewish question. If you could take a moment, take a pen, write down, why do you think the Jews are a consistent target for persecution and hatred throughout, have been a target for persecution and hatred throughout history? Write down 3 issues that you would consider the primary causes of anti-Semitism. As soon as anybody's ready to share, I'd love to hear about that.
have a statement.
Okay, go ahead.
Many years ago, between 5 and 7 years ago, there at the Chabad, we had a special speaker come and talk to us. He was a journalist. He was a Jewish journalist.
Mm-hmm.
He was saying that when journalists and newspapers and all those different media outlets come there to talk about the news of which is going on there, the Palestinians meet them at the airport, they give them transportation, they give them a place to stay, and they wine them and dine them. So he was saying, of course, they're going to be jaded when they see how the Palestinians treat them and feed them information. And then the Jews, they're worried about defending themselves. So you need to ask your father-in-law about that speaker that came.
I remember that speaker. I guess here's my question. That's the reporters on the ground. Why is it that we're seeing from these AP reporters, and that could be part of the reason, but why is it we're seeing even from inside news organizations that there are policies that are specifically in place to avoid any reporting of things that are anti or whatever, that are pro-Israel and that are anti-Palestinian, etc. Why is it that can't be explained that way, right? So that's definitely part of it. But there's more to the story. Let's try to focus on the question at hand. Why are the Jews a consistent target for persecution? What's the reasons for anti-Semitism? Don't worry, we're not going to do justice to this topic. We have a whole course coming up, but I want to hear your opinions. This is going to help me very much in preparing for the class. Lon, why don't you get us started?
I'm going to just say there was not in any particular order, although the first one is the biggest. Lack of information about what's really happening within the relationship to societies within which a Jewish group lives or people. The fact that Jews are educated and others are often not educated. But the biggest one I say is jealousy over a organized society that is successful.
Well, I think the 3 points you mentioned are all tied into each other. In other words, the first one I want to give
They are tied into each other. But lack of information about what's happening, which is the same criticism I have of Israel more than anything, is they do not do a good job getting their message out.
Yes, 100%. And well spoken as somebody who works in the Hollywood industry. You're like, you got to get your PR together, right? Now, but 1 second.
Israel needs to get its PR together.
1 second. Before we talk about that, lack of information is never enough. Okay, we have lack of information about how random tribes in the middle of the Amazon are operating. That doesn't cause us to hate them, right? Lack of information is a passive reason. We're looking for active reasons here. So the second two that you mentioned, I think, go very well together, which is you're saying Jews are well educated. It's been in our culture for years, and that leads to us being more successful, and they're jealous of that. Is that a fair kind of summary? Okay, Joanne, go ahead.
Okay. Well, from somebody who grew up in a very Protestant environment, okay, I think the main reason, I'm going to put it all on Christianity and, the Jews killed Jesus and all this kind of stuff, that because even though, yes, before there was Christianity, there was prejudice, but there've always been prejudice against somebody who's the other, no matter who they are. But why Jews are so singled out today and for the last 2,000 years, I'm going to lay it on Christianity. I mean, I remember Mickey telling a story when he was, maybe he'll tell you tonight, when he was a kid and he had a friend he used to play with, and the friend asked him if he was Jewish. And then, I don't remember exactly what, and then the friend said, oh, I'm not supposed to play with Jews, and that whole thing about, Jews killing Christ. Most Christians, I'll tell you, they don't even know that Jesus was Jewish. They don't even know that. I mean, and the things the church has done historically, not that the Protestants and the Catholics were slaughtering each other's too, but right. I'm going to put a big blame on Christianity, because for a long time when Jews lived in the Muslim world, yeah, they were probably discriminated against with other non-Muslim people. But before the establishment of Israel, it wasn't as much of a problem. So the main thing, I think it's really gonna lay it all on Christianity. Sorry.
Okay. All right.
My best friend in high school was a Christian, so.
Okay, no problem. But by the way, it's not a problem. It's not a problem to say that Christian theology is that way, but then not all Christians are bad people. We always have to remember to separate those things. Just because Christian theology says so, there are many people who interpret Christian theology different, right? There are like the evangelicals, for instance, are some of the greatest supporters of Jews and
My best friend has been Christian.
right.
So,
Exactly.
many of
So
them.
I'm just reminding you that you're not being anti-Christian in that way. Just
I'm not.
And I'll back you up that historically some of the worst anti-Semitism, right? Think the Crusaders, think the Spanish Inquisition has been Christian ideologically based. But I'm going to talk about that in a moment, and I'll show you why that's not entirely fair to blame it all on them, but it's fair to give some of it to it, okay? And because whatever, we're definitely going to need a combination of reasons, but I want to see if Heidi had anything to say before we keep moving. What do you think? Heidi.
Oh, sorry.
You want to share? If you
well,
want to share, that's fine.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I always want to share. Sure. So, yeah, I also grew up in a predominantly Christian town where there were only 3 Jews in my high school. I was not one of them. I would be now, but I wasn't one of them.
Right.
And, you know, they were seen as sort of the other. And I don't think they got direct discrimination exactly, but they were sort of seen as different, and we didn't really understand why. I think that the tenets of the Jewish religion demand that Jews hold themselves to a higher standard. So when other people are acting badly and they see Jews acting in a, you know, their behavior showing integrity and kindness and all this, you know, they feel like it makes them look bad. And so you want to get rid of the people that make you look bad. So by comparison, you know, if you're, you know, running stoplights and robbing banks and doing stuff that is like maybe isn't so nice, maybe running people over in the crosswalk, and the people that are being kind and backing off and not getting into arguments, like you want those people to go away.
Nobody likes a goody two shoes.
Nobody likes a goody two shoes.
Okay, so we have a couple problems here. Thank you, Heidi, for sharing. We got a lot of insight here. Okay, and I will even mention that to answer our question, why are Jews targeted for persecution and hatred throughout history? Here are the 3 that I had prepared, and we pretty much knocked them all nail on the head. Number 1, religious theology. That's basically exactly what Joanne said. Number 2 is chosenness. I don't know if that's exactly what Heidi said, right? Because sometimes it's not necessarily the fact that we're acting better. It's more just the general idea that we consider ourselves the chosen people. People don't like that, jealousy, etc. And here is basically what Lon said: economic reasons or success or anything else that goes into that category. There is, however, a little bit of flaw, and I'd like to try to. And there were other reasons that were mentioned. I'd like to try to address these 3 and talk about why none of them really fully answer the anti-Semitism question. And let's start with number 1, religious theology. First of all, in and of themselves, they show that none of them fully addresses it, right? Because if there are 3 reasons, and I don't think anybody can deny that each of these reasons is a force behind anti-Semitism, so then that itself shows you that anti-Semitism is not a one-trick pony, right? But let's try to address each one of them one at a time. And then we'll get to the whole anti-Israel, anti-Semitism discussion. To Joanne's point about religious theology, a couple points. First of all, that definitely doesn't explain anti-Jewish sentiment in a place that doesn't have any Christians or any Islamists for that matter. Japan is a great example. How do we land in a place like Japan and people hate us, right? How do Jews who are running away from, number 1. Number 2, and more importantly probably, what about some of the greatest atrocities against Jews that were carried out indiscriminately against Jews that were religious and Jews that weren't religious, right? So take, for example, the Holocaust, where Hitler's doctrine was, even if you're 1/8 Jewish, that's it. Off you go, out you go, etc. Right? What about the fact that people might have converted to Christianity, right? To him, that wasn't an issue. I understand that it might explain the Spanish Inquisition, it might explain the Crusaders, etc., but it doesn't fully explain other elements of anti-Semitism that exist. And I would add anti-Israel to that as well. You can't really lump anti-Israel sentiment under the bus together with Christian theology, because actually Christians are very supportive of Israel, right? So that doesn't explain that one either. So it doesn't fully explain. Text 4 which is from Nathan Sharansky, kind of touches on this a little bit. And I think we are back at Lon, but he looks like he's eating. So why don't we go to Joanne? Lon, are you up to reading? Oh, you are. Okay, fine. So go ahead. So text 4 is from Nathan Sharansky, talking about
in 2003, this was written.
Right. He's talking about anti-Jewish sentiment obviously through the purview of anti-Jewish sentiment in the former Soviet Union. Okay, because a lot of Jews dropped Judaism then. It's important to remember that. And yet they were still just as hated. Go ahead.
And he spent years in a Soviet prison as a political prisoner.
That's the way he looks at the world. Go ahead.
What makes the Soviet case instructive is, in no small measure, the fact that the professed purpose of communism was to abolish all nations, peoples, and religions, those great engines of exclusion, nations, people, and religions, great engines of exclusion on the road to the creation of a new world and a new man. In the eyes of Stalin and his henchmen, the Jews, starting with the loyal communists among them, were always suspect, quote, ideological immigrants. In the telling phrase, but the animosity went beyond Jewish communists. The Soviet regime declared war on the over 100 nationalities and religions under its boot. Whole peoples were deported, entire classes destroyed, millions starved to death, and tens of millions killed. Everybody suffered, not only Jews. But decades later, long after Stalin's repression had given way to Khrushchev's thaw, only one national language, Hebrew, was still banned in the Soviet Union. Only one group, the Jews, was not permitted to establish schools for its children. Only in the case of one group, the Jews, did the term fifth line referring to the space reserved for nationality on a Soviet citizen's identification papers become a code for licensed discrimination. Genius.
This speaks for itself. Now, okay, so now we get to point number 2. All right, so obviously this doesn't explain anti-Semitism as a whole. Point number 2, chosen nation, differentness, the fact that we hold ourselves to a higher standard. We have a Torah. We possibly at some points in history can be blamed for lording it over other people, etc. Right? So text 5 is one example of that, right? That's directly from the story of Purim. This is the reason that Haman gives for why he wants to destroy the Jewish people. Joanne, can you, you know what, Stephanie, I think now you have a better connection. You want to read for us, please? Text 5.
Sure. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered among and separate from the people throughout all the province of your kingdom. Their laws differ from those of every people, and they do not keep the king's laws. It is therefore of no use for the king to let them be. If it pleases the king, let it be decreed to destroy them.
So this would seem to explain a lot, right? The chosen people, you walk around saying that you're better than everyone else. Of course, right? If you consider yourself a nation above all other nations, of course people are going to want to destroy you. Here's the problem. There are some major Jewish persecutions. Spanish Inquisition, by the way, this time works the other way, right? Spanish Inquisition happened at a time when the exact opposite was true. The Jewish people were extremely assimilated. That was considered one of the golden eras for Jewish business people and being in government and all that sort of thing. They weren't considering themselves different at all. Many Jews that considered themselves Spanish Jews before they considered themselves to be Spanish before Jews, right? Because this was a time of great assimilation. And another era, by the way, the Holocaust is another good example of this. Because think right before the Holocaust, we always look at the era right before the persecution. Right before the Holocaust was, that was the height of the Reform movement. Right, it was the height of Jews saying, the Enlightenment, and saying we have to not be like we have to start being like everyone else around us. And yet, right after that came the Holocaust, which indiscriminatorily discriminated against Jews, right, without getting into whether they were religious, whether they weren't enlightened, they were, which I think leads us to text 6. Which really we're not even going to need to address economic concerns, because this is really going to wipe the whole thing off the map. But the economic ideas would be straight out of the Protocols of Zion, right? Jews control the Federal Reserve, Jews control this, that. For those of you that remember when Frank Mink, right, a white supremacist, a former neo-Nazi, came and spoke here, and we're still not sure whether he's Jewish or not, right? But either way, he's definitely a reformed anti-Semite, and now he has great respect for Jewish people. And we spoke about how that shift came about. He came here and lectured him. It was amazing. And many of you might have seen my op-ed that I wrote in it was in the Pasadena Star News, right, about him after meeting him and hearing his whole story, because I was very involved in his story and bringing him down here, etc. So that was his major belief, right? He grew up hearing all the jokes about don't Jew me, right? Being synonymous with don't mess me over, and that kind of thing. The problem with that is that anti-Semites have always taken both extremes. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And I will point, by the way, to how ridiculous, because in today's day and age, we see it again. Who are the primary sources? I mean, we don't really know, right? But at least so far as attacks that are being carried out against Jews, and so far as some of the terrible language being held out against Jews, where are they coming from today in today's political spectrum? The far right and the far left. That's where they're coming from. On the far right, you have white supremacists, neo-Nazis, etc., with their rallies, and I can bring you clear examples of those. And on the far left, you have Black Hebrew organizations and without even getting to anti-Israel sentiment, which usually comes from the far left, but the Black Hebrew organizations, the ones that committed the attacks against the Black Israelites, I think they call themselves usually, right? The ones that committed the attacks against Jersey City and Jersey Shore, etc. And there were a few different attacks they carried out. So you see it on two different sides. How could they both be blaming us for the same thing? These two people are diametrically opposed to each other philosophically. It's somehow the Jews are the one thing they have in common, that they hate the Jews. And Rabbi Menachem Zemba points out in text 6, and Joanne, I'll ask you to read this for us, please, that this has consistently been the case. Jews have always been blamed for having diametrically opposed issues. Yet somehow it always leads to the same road, which is anti-Semitism.
Many seek to uncover the root cause and justifications for anti-Semitism. History has demonstrated, however, that not a single cause is correct. The hatred defies cause or reason. Here they hate the Jews because they're capitalists. There they hate them because they're socialists. Here they hate the Jews because they are industrious and shrewd. There they hate them because they are a burden on society who provide no benefit to the citizenry. Here they hate Jews because they are excessively religious and zealous. There they hate them because they are liberal, enlightened, and promulgate secular views. The reasons are always contradictory.
I mean, it's crazy, right? Jews are blamed today. Jews are blamed for being the source of all liberal views, any progressive views that America has, whether it's pro-women and pro-gays and the gay pride, all that sort of stuff, right? Equal rights, all that sort of. Jews are blamed for bringing that to the table by those that disagree with that, usually the far right, right? And Jews are blamed with bringing things to the table in terms of conservatism and being pro other things that the human rights and that sort of thing by people people disagree with those. The story always seems to be the same, and this is a problem. Now, I want to point out, without really getting into the whole anti-Semitism thing, because I definitely, because I've begun to prepare the anti-Semitism course, one thing that I want to remind us before we get into the whole anti-Israel versus anti-Semite discussion, I just want to remind us very clearly that the one common denominator that all these approaches have are doing wrong is that we have a problem is anti-Semitism, and we tend to look into ourselves and say that we are the issue. Oh, we're not capitalist enough. Oh, we're not socialist enough. Oh, we're not religious enough. Oh, we're not secular enough. And we tend to look into ourselves and say, we are the problem. What can we do to fix it? Which, by the way, is actually a very healthy attitude towards things in general, right? If somebody comes over to you and says, you are a XYZ, right? Usually it's healthy to look inside and say, is this something that I actually need to deal with? Is this something that I actually, you always get angry, right? Do I have anger management issues? Do I need to deal with that, right? The problem with it is when it doesn't seem to add up. We also have to have the fortitude and the self-confidence to be able to say, it's not us. Because clearly, whichever way we go, we don't seem to be able to solve the problem that the anti-Semite has with us. And if that's the case, if the problem is not us, then the problem is them, right? Okay, but that's a conversation for a whole different time, and we're going to really address that in the course on anti-Semitism, which now that I've been able to prepare it, I'm super impressed with how they put it together. They don't talk about that much about why anti-Semitism exists. They spend a lot more time focusing on what we can do about it. They don't spend that much time talking about how much we should care about anti-Semitism and how much we should be doing about it. They spend a lot more time talking about how we shouldn't let it get us anxious what recognizing which parts we can control, which parts we can't control, and what our correct attitude should be to each one of them. Anyways, I'm very impressed with how the course was done. But let's leave anti-Semitism aside for now. I think we've done it a little bit of justice, although nowhere near enough, and we're going to talk about it in the course starting in October. By the way, I should mention that if you register in the aftermath of this course, which means within a week or so after this course, you get $10 off, and I'll send you that coupon in the mail in the final follow-up email, which will go out tonight after this course. Okay, so there's $10 off per person, so $20 off for a couple, $10 off for individuals. But let's get to the heart of the issue, which is, so how much does anti-Israel sentiment play into anti-Semitism, right? Is anti-Israel sentiment anti-Semitism? So I would definitely start off with my Ralph story, right? That I'm walking through Ralph's just because of a kippah, a beard, and tzitzit. Somebody looks at me and says, "Oh, I'm very concerned about the plight of Palestinians." And when I dig for more, she proceeds to say that it's my fault because I'm Jewish. So as anecdotal evidence, I think that goes very, very far. So even if some people who maybe hold themselves high and mighty and say, "Oh, I distinguish between the two of them, and I'm only anti-Israel, but I'm not anti-Jewish, and some of my best friends are Jewish, etc." It's not really fair to separate them, because on the ground, most people are not separating them, and they kind of tie one into the other. But I think text 7 really sums this up the best, because Jonathan Sachs, as always, or I should say, former chief rabbi of the UK, Lord Dr. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, alav hashalom, who just passed away recently, has an amazing summary of anti-Semitism, which segues right into the anti-Israel discussion. Heidi, if you can read for us, please. We really appreciate that. Just unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in so doing defeats the immune system set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. This is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion had lost prestige, and the supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudosciences: social Darwinism, the idea that in society, as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race. By the late 20th century, science had lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews, or the Jewish state, are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity.
Thank you, Heidi. And this is very, very clear when you start to look at when anti-Semitism rises. The ADL, right, the Anti-Defamation League points out that there's always a spike in anti-Jewish crime, right? And we saw this just recently with the anecdotal evidence. Talk about the streets of Los Angeles eating sushi, right? Jews eating sushi. They're just Jewish. There's nothing else about them other than that they're Jewish. But a conflict in Israel immediately affects Jews sitting on, what was it, Wilshire? I don't remember where it was, or on Pico, whatever it was, eating sushi, they get attacked. That's just how it works. So you don't really get to say that anti-Israel doesn't lead to and isn't directly married to anti-Semitism, because it's always like that. Text 8 is an example of that, but for time we'll move past that. It's just one example of when we see that anti-Israel bias or anti-Israel sentiment immediately leads or is directly connected to anti-Semitism. So we've reached the following, maybe perhaps sobering conclusions. Number one, I think we have a slide for this. Number one is that the commonly assumed reasons for anti-Semitism are superficial. They're not enough to really describe what the reason for it is. And though it is possible that now this new reason of being critical of Israel in some weird divorced to reality world can be divorced from anti-Semitism, know that again is another reason for anti-Semitism. So if anti-Israel bias is in fact just another form of anti-Semitism, then the way we deal with that and how we solve that has to be identical to anti-Semitism, right? That's basically where we are here. But it doesn't really answer the question of where do we go, right? What is the solution? So that's what we'll spend the rest of the lesson today doing. Historically, Jews have tried to deal with anti-Semitism in a variety of ways, blending into society and remaining separate from society, right? It was always a reaction to whatever the anti-Semitism was. If the anti-Semitism was blaming Jews for blending in too much to society, so they tried to remain separate. And if it was to remain separate, then they tried to blend in. I think both of them have not been successful. Blending into their surroundings is most evident by the Holocaust. I think pre the Holocaust was probably one of the highest levels of assimilation, and Jews living among non-Jews, just like them. And for some reason that didn't work, and it led to the Holocaust. And I think in order to disprove the second version, which is remaining separate, I think the state of Israel is a perfect example. We've said we'll be as separate can be, and yet somehow the world is still obsessed with us and still feels need to hate that country where we chose to be separate out of all the countries in the world. And by the way, that was one of the intentions of the founders of the state of Israel, right? Let's go somewhere. We'll have our own country. Then they won't bother us. They won't tell us anymore, go home, go back to where you came from, right? And yet we come to Israel, and what does everybody tell us? Go home. This is not where you guys belong. Stop occupying this land. Go back to where you came from. And you even hear in some of these videos that float around on the internet or on social media, you see people saying, go back to Europe. That's where you guys really, really belong. And you're like, so where do we belong? There's nowhere, right? So I'd like to present the Torah's perspective, which is also going to be touched on and really elaborated on and really fleshed out properly in the upcoming course, which is the sheep among the wolves doctrine. We could really open with text 9, but for the sake of time, we'll move past that. An equal text to text 9 is when Mark Twain ends off. What's the famous words that he ends off his observation about the Jews? He wants to know, how did they survive, right? How is it possible that Jews survived? What is the secret to Jewish immortality? By the way, Jews have survived, and Jews are also the most persecuted nation on earth, which makes this question even more powerful, right? So the best way to answer this question, I think, is by dissecting a conversation that's reported in the Talmud between Hadrian, who was one of the Roman emperors who kind of had his ups and downs with the Jews. In the beginning, he was more friendly, and later on with the Bar Kokhba rebellion, he wasn't so friendly. This is from his more friendly time, and when he had a relationship with a rabbi whose name was Rabbi Yoshua, and Lon, I think we're holding. If you can please read for us text 10, Alone Among the Wolves.
Okay, stand by, getting the right page.
Page 238.
This is text 10 here.
Mm-hmm.
The Roman Emperor Hadrian said to Rabbi Yeshua, "Great is the sheep that survives in the midst of 70 wolves." Rabbi Yehoshua responded, "Great is the shepherd who saves the sheep, protects it, and vanquishes the wolves that wish to attack it."
Clearly, this is a coded conversation. Thank you, Lon, for reading it for us. Just some background here. Hadrian is clearly referring to the 70 nations of the world as they are listed in terms of the descendants of Noach. After Noach, of course, right, the world started again, and Noach is said to have had 70 descendants who started 70 nations. Each is the ancestor of one of the world's nations. So those are the 70 wolves, and the Jewish people is the sheep, right? Hadrian is praising the sheep and saying, like Mark Twain and like text 9, Blaise Pascal, etc., right? He's saying, amazing. How do these people manage to survive no matter what? It must say something. It's a testament to the Jewish people. They're an amazing people. And Yeshua looks at him and says, I just have to correct you on one point. He says, it's not great as the sheep, rather great as the shepherd. In other words, there is divine intervention. You want to know what the secret to Jewish immortality is? You want to know what the secret is why Jews have always survived? It is because God always intervenes on their behalf. Which leads us to text 11. I'll just set it up for a moment because this is a fascinating text. Text 11 comes to us from the famous prophecy of Bilam or Balaam, right? For those of you that are not familiar, in the Torah, Balak who is a Midianite king, I believe. In other words, a non-Jewish king who wants to destroy the Jewish people as they're at the borders of the land of Israel. He realizes that conquering the Jews is not just a physical battle, but it's also a spiritual battle. So you kind of got to get the spiritual, godly forces on your side, right? They clearly left Egypt with 10 plagues, etc. So he hires this prophet, this non-Jewish prophet, not a false prophet, a true prophet, but a non-Jewish prophet named Bilam to curse the Jewish people. Now, the nature of prophecy is, you can look this up in the Webster's Dictionary if you'd like, is that you don't get to say anything you'd like. You only get to say the words of God. So Bilam, who really is kind of rebelling against God and going to say prophecy against the Jewish people, despite God's desire that this shouldn't happen, don't ask me how that worked in his brain, but somehow it did, that he was going to prophesy, so would say the word of God, and he believed in God, but somehow cursed the Jewish people, ends up, of course, only saying the word of God and blessing the Jewish people. So we get all of these blessings, and actually the commentary have a field day with this, pointing out that from his blessing you can see what his curse was meant to be, but in reality it ends up coming out as a blessing. Okay, and then of course the Jewish people take that and they incorporate that into their prayers. So one of our famous prayers, which is Matovu Alecha Yaakov, comes directly from Bilam's supposed curses, which ended up being blessings, etc. So one of his curses converted to blessings is, Stephanie, can you read for us, please? Text 11.
Yes. Behold, it is a people that dwell alone, and it is not a reckon among the nations.
All right, raise of hands. Is that a blessing or a curse? Raise of hands for blessing. Raise of hands for curse. The nation that dwells alone. We have no opinions here. It can go either way. Okay, you guys are reminding me of one of the most famous interviews. Again, I will link that. I have to start writing down what I'm going to link. I'll link it in the... This is fascinating. This is well worth your 5 minutes of time to watch. An interview with, I want to say it's Yitzchak Shamir, one of the prime ministers of Israel, who talks about his private audience with the Rebbe. And they ended up at length discussing this particular verse. They hold it as a people that dwells alone and is not reckoned among the nations. And their conversation was, is it by choice or is it by force?
Choice.
And the conclusion that they came to is that it's actually a blend of both. In other words, sometimes one leads to the other and the other leads to the other, right? In other words, it's not always the Jews choosing to do it. Sometimes it's the non-Jews forcing us to dwell alone. And sometimes it's us choosing to live alone, which leads to the non-Jews kind of forcing us to lead alone. Either way, I think this says a lot about the Jewish people. Why is this a blessing? Right? Because of course this has to be a blessing because it's part of Bilam's words, and we know that the whole story is that instead of being a curse, it was a blessing. So perhaps this is one of those where we see clearly what the curse was intended and what the blessing is. But what is the blessing today? The blessing is that the Jewish people dwell alone philosophically, and that they do not regard the non-Jews or the rest of the world as their source of salvation. Now, before we do this, I have to quickly give a disclaimer that this does not mean that we don't believe that we can play any role in our faith or that anybody else can play any role in our faith. This doesn't mean we just say to the US, goodbye, and we don't need any help from you. Right? It doesn't mean that we say to all the nations of the world, we don't need any help with you. But what it does mean is that our be-all and end-all salvation is God. So whereas we support the IDF, we serve in the IDF, we try to be masters of our own faith, we are always aware of the fact that we don't place, and I'll quote another part of davening, forget the exact words, but in one of the Hallelujahs, I think it's Psalm 146 or 147, we say, silly is the man who places his faith in human beings and not in the supreme ruler of this world, right? That is what is being meant by this prayer. In other words, there have been times when Jews have curried favor and have had people in high places that have been able to help them. And among those is even the story of Purim, right? But never have Jews relied on that. We always have to rely on God. And this brings me back to start tying the lesson back to the beginning. At the beginning of today's lesson, we started off with a question. Why would God give us a land, supposedly a land flowing in milk and honey with all the blessings in the world, and yet that land seems to be sorely lacking, sorely insufficient to provide for all of our needs? Text 12, Rabbeinu Bechaya ben Asher gives us some very, very powerful insight. Joanne, if you please, just don't forget to unmute yourself. Text 12, we're on page 239.
God did not give you a self-irrigating land like Egypt, so that you should not be able to water the land yourself. Instead, your attention will always turn to him and the key to the rain that he holds.
Rabbeinu Bechaya points out a very powerful thing. He says, look, if Hashem had given us a perfect land, that would have given us every perfect right to say, goodbye, we don't need you. And Hashem didn't want that. So he said, I'm going to give them a land that is perfect in every respect besides for one. And in that one respect, there will be nothing that they can really do about it. Even today with Israel's water carrying system and all the beautiful things, if it doesn't rain in Israel for years at a time, the Jewish people will be at a loss. And this leads, by the way, to some of the most interesting literature that we have. I don't know if we have any Talmudic scholars here, people that have gone through the Talmud a little bit, but there's a full tractate in the Talmud called Tractate Ta'anit, which means the tractate of fasts. And it doesn't talk for one iota in that whole tractate about the 5 fasts.
What?
The tractate of fast days. Fast days. Okay? And it doesn't talk even once about Yom Kippur or about Tisha B'Av or Asara B'Tevet or any of the fast or Tzom Gedalia or the ones that you're familiar with. The entire tractate is dedicated to this concept that when it doesn't rain, the Jews are in Israel, it's not raining, and this is a big problem for us because we need to figure this out. When do we dedicate a fast day for that? When do we not? How quickly do we turn to God and say we got to pray and we got to dedicate this as a public fast day? A whole tractate, all about the lack of rain in the land of Israel. The Rebbe, by the way, this doesn't really tie into our lesson, it just ties into this idea, which I think is a very powerful idea. The Rebbe pointed out, or I think would often point out, that actually the creation of man works the same way. When God created a human being, he created him perfect in every facet, except that he's sorely lacking. Every human being is born with an inherent feeling of, I'm not complete. I need to find meaning in my life. Viktor Frankl calls this man's search for meaning, right? I would just say, look at all the people searching the world looking for truth, and you'll see it clearly. Hashem created us with a lack. How come we can't just live and be? How come no human being could just live and come and be and that's it and leave? How come we need to accomplish? We need to feel satisfied. We're constantly seeking truth and meaning in our lives. Because Hashem created us in a way that even if everything is going right in your life, every once in a while you got to look up. You got to try to figure out what is, and we try to fill that void with all sorts of things. But he created us in a way that we got to try to look for him. Now, we don't necessarily find him. We can find other things instead. So now let's revisit text 13, right, which we read at the beginning of the class. Heidi, please.
Am I muted? No.
No, you're good.
Okay. But the land that you are crossing, the Jordan River, to possess is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. It is a land that your God cares for. The eyes of your God are continually upon it from the beginning of the year to its end.
Does anybody remember when we contrasted this to Egypt? Thank you, Heidi. Does anybody remember when we contrasted this to Egypt? Let's remember what Egypt did. Egypt had water, a very firm source of water, and that ended up becoming their deity, their God. They served the Nile River, right? The Talmud is full of this. That's also part of why the 10 plagues started with the Nile River, because that was the idol worship of Egypt. They worshipped the Nile River. Moses reminds us in text 13 that Hashem doesn't need us to rely on water that comes from any natural or any other sources, and he doesn't need us to deify it, certainly not. He doesn't want us to deify it, certainly not. He says, I'm putting you in a land where every once in a while you're going to have to look up and remember that I'm in charge. Let's take a quick break for questions. We're running a little late, but I feel like that was a very, very strong point, that we were leading up to that point for a while. Any questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Do you draw any parallels between the Israelites being in the desert for 40 years, complaining, and also being rationed, shall we say, by God, provided for, and that the transition into going into the promised land, Israel at that time, or if you look at modern Israel, that the fact that it's not perfect is in a way a similar situation that we historically have been in since the Jews in the desert, where through the searching for understanding of our relationship with God, we will then cross into Israel. And when we do, we're still going to be stuck with the same issue we had. And I feel like there's a very strong correlation between those two stories. That's my question. Do you draw that conclusion, or am I out of left field?
No, so you're not out of left field. Not only do I draw that parallel, I will point you out to somebody who does. And ironically, it's another rabbi by the name of Rabbeinu Bechaya, right? So the point that we just introduced is introduced by Rabbeinu Bechaya ben Asher, who lived in the 12th century primarily, right? If you take a look at his biography on the side. But there's another Rabbeinu, very famous Rabbeinu Bechaya, whose name is Rabbeinu Bechaya ibn Pakuda, who lived in the 11th century, and wrote a book called Duties of the Heart, which I strongly recommend for everyone. Particularly, I recommend this book, which is not his entire. So I now have another thing that I'm going to have to link after this. I'm going to link it right now.
Thank you for that.
I'm gonna tell you 1 second.
No, I said thank you for that.
Okay, just writing it down like that. I remember to link it in the follow-up email. This is a book which is not even his entire composition. Okay, so his book is called Obligations of the Heart, or Duties of the Heart, Chovot Halavavot. And essentially what he says is, there's enough Jewish literature that talks about the obligations of the limbs, obligations of the body, like how to put on tefillin, how to light Shabbat candles, and how to keep Shabbat, etc. What we need is more on Chovat Halavavot, obligations of the heart, how to love God, how to fear God, etc. Gate number 4, or chapter number 4, is called Shara Bitachon, which means the gate of trust. And this is a book that I highly, highly recommend. You can buy it, I think, it just recently came out. It's at gateoftrust.org. I gave a full class based on this book for about a year, the first year of COVID, 12 months. We went through this book in its entirety. The book wasn't out yet, but I was in touch with the publisher, and they gave me like a PDF of like a, typo filled, and then swore me to not release it and give it to anybody, etc. So I would just share it on Zoom, a typo filled pre-draft. But now it's out. You can buy it. I think it's at gateoftrust.org, but I'll link it in the email. So this is an amazing book, and it talks all about trust in God. Okay, that's the whole thing. Now, Rabbeinu Bechaya ibn Pakuda was a philosopher, which means that a lot of his conversation, of course, he mentions lots of biblical verses and why we should trust in God, but he also talks about the philosophy of trusting in God, the rational reasons for why we should trust in God. And one of the things he points out, Lon, I think this is exactly the point you're making, he says, listen, you have to look at the whole series of stories and how that worked. The Jewish people were supposed to enter the land of Israel immediately. They were withheld from that because of a story of spies who aroused from within the Jewish people a lack of trust in God. And as a result of that, the Jewish people were condemned to be 40 years in the desert, and then they were allowed to enter the land of Israel. Right? On a very simplistic level, one thing that happened during those 40 years was that every single Jew, with the exclusion of 2, Joshua and Caleb, every single Jew died out during those 40 years. And it was a brand new generation that now entered the land of Israel. There's lots of discussion about what happened over those 40 years that would now make this a generation worthy of it. Rabbeinu Bechaya points out that what God now did was, he said, the new generation is now worthy because what I did was, during those 40 years, I trained them, and dare I say, Darwin would say, I even genetically modified them. In other words, every single Jew during those 40 years lived in a different natural world to the one we live in today, or to the one that the Jews pre those 40 years lived. The 40 years that they lived in the desert, they were completely reliant on God. There was no such thing as not trusting God. How could you not trust God to send manna from heaven every single morning? That's what you live on. How could you not trust God to literally clean the clothing you're on, or to have clouds of glory protecting you from all of the elements? So for 40 years, the Jewish people are living and being trained to trust in God. By the time 40 years are over, there's now no Jews left who know of any other existence other than being completely trustworthy and reliant on God. And now Hashem says, now you're ready to enter the land of Israel. You're ready to enter natural existence, quote unquote, where now you'll need to exercise your trust. I think that's exactly the point you were making, Lon. Am I correct?
It is the point I was making.
Right. So if you'd like to see it inside, I'll up to you. I'll text privately exactly what page in that book. If you purchase it, or if you'd like to borrow it from me, I can show you exactly where he mentions that point. Okay. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that adds a lot to the class, even though it means that we'll probably be even more overtime. Okay. But I think you guys know already now to clear your schedules till 3 o'clock. All right. I don't think we'll go till 3, but I have one more point I'd like to make today. If you remember, one of the points that we discussed in the past was that there was one individual who never suffered the cognitive dissonance, one human being in the entire world who didn't suffer the cognitive dissonance before the 6th day warning, after the 6th day warning, and that was the Rebbe. The reason we said is because he had full trust in Hashem. That's the way he looked at Israel's existence. Israel's existence is miraculous to begin with and to end with. So what was the Rebbe's approach before the 6th day war? Israel is missing water. Israel is being faced with exactly the situation that Rabbeinu Bechaya just described, where Hashem is giving them an opportunity to look up and trust in him, trust in me for the water, trust in me to win the war. The Rebbe's approach was, let's collectively arouse the trust and the faith of the Jewish people in God. Stephanie, let's start with text 14. The Rebbe quoted this, the amount of times that in 1967, right before the 6th day war and then during the 6th day war, that the Rebbe quoted this is unbelievable. Go ahead.
All the nations of earth will see that God's name is invoked upon you, and they will fear you. It is taught by the Rebbe Elazar, the Great said, this is a reference to the tefillin of the head, upon which the name of God is written.
Thank you, Stephanie. So the Talmud tells us that if you want to evoke the fear instead of fear, I would put the word respect. You want that people should respect you, be true to who you are. Be true to being a nation that belongs to God and that has faith in God and has trust in Hashem. And on that day, in 1967, was born the famous, anybody? Tefillin campaign. We have the 6th day war to thank for the fact that every time you walk down the streets of New York, or even in Los Angeles, or if Rabbi Rifkin knocks on your door, he says, hey, have you put on tefillin yet? It's time to put on tefillin. Come on, let's put on tefillin. One more time. I know you did it yesterday. Let's do it again till let's put on tefillin. In text 15, an article in the Boston Globe chronicles just how many hundreds of thousands of people, because Chabadniks fanned out during the 6th day war. They would drive down to military bases. The Rebbe specifically wanted IDF soldiers to be putting them on. Lon, if you can read for us, please, text 15.
Since the 6th day war in June, which resulted in the creation of United Jerusalem as part of Israel, more than 400,000 members of the Jewish faith are estimated to have observed the commandment to wear phylacteries.
That's the English word for tefillin, which I'm not sure why there even is an English word.
Never knew what that was.
Okay, go ahead.
City Center, formerly known as the Wailing Wall. Just before the outbreak of the war, an active campaign to push observance by Jewish males over 13 years of age of the mitzvah of blessing of tefillin was launched by Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, the Lubavitch of Rabbi, New York, leader of a Hasidic sect with branches throughout the world.
Immediately after the Rebbe launched this campaign, immediately after the success of the 6th day war, the Rebbe suggested that a tefillin booth be erected near the Western Wall. And 55 years later, to date, that booth still stands there, and there is no Jew who walks onto the plaza of the Western Wall and isn't accosted by some Chabadnik saying, excuse me, sir, have you had a chance to put on tefillin today? Because to the Rebbe, these 2 points were extremely interlinked. Putting on tefillin, or the general idea of expressing faith in God, that's what tefillin is all about. The meditation that we think when we put on tefillin is we put it directly across from our brain and directly across from our heart in order that we give over our thoughts and our emotions to God, that we're reliant on God. It's this idea that faith is directly connected to the security of the land of Israel. To the Rebbe, it was transparent. It was clear that this is what it was all about. I'll point out that on our upcoming trip to Israel, if you're considering joining us, and I highly encourage you to, we will be going to the Western Wall. You'll get to see the booth, the historical booth, might I add. And even if you don't join us, but you go to Israel on your own, please make a point of stopping by. I also want to say that if there's anybody on this, and I guess I'm talking directly to Lon and to some of the others that are on watching the recording now, but so far as live on Zoom, Lon, I'm talking directly to you. If you don't have a pair of tefillin, you'd like to buy one, and start putting them on however often you're ready to, whether that's once a week or every day. I'd be happy to help you with purchasing a pair of tefillin. I think it would be a very, very appropriate thing to do as a takeaway from this course. So that's that. Or if you have a pair of tefillin, get them checked by a scribe or a sofer, etc. And start making a habit of putting them on. Okay, let's end off by reading text 17 and 18 as kind of a real wrap up of the whole course, the journey that we've been taking over the past 6 weeks. Joanne, if you can get us started with text 17.
Citing the words, Jacob refused to be consoled, Rashi explains, because a person is not consoled over the living. Over one who has truly passed, a person is eventually consoled, because it has been decreed that the memory of the deceased should fade. But when a person is only thought to be dead, but is in fact alive, as was the case with Joseph, those who mourn that person are not consoled. The same is true regarding Jerusalem. Were she truly and hopelessly dead, God forbid, we would have long forgotten her, as every deceased is forgotten. But seeing that some 2,000 years have elapsed, yet Jerusalem and the land of Israel have not been forgotten from our hearts, this is a sure sign that they live within us.
Thank you, Joanne. I think we have spent 6 weeks now talking about a land that for thousands of years, really, you could say, had nothing to do with the Jewish people. Technically, they weren't living there. I mean, there was always Jews living there, right? But like most Jews were outside of the land of Israel. They were exiled from there. And you could kind of say, get over it, right? Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, text 17, is pointing out that Rashi reminds us in the story of Jacob, he says Jacob refused to be consoled about Joseph during the 22 years when he was living in Egypt. And he points out that this is human nature. Human nature is that if a person is actually dead, then slowly we allow ourselves to be consoled over it. I understand there are psychological concepts called chronic grief or whatever the words for it are, right, where people can't get over when someone passes away. But for the most part, human nature, the natural way of the world works, for better or for worse, is that after a loved one passes away, it starts off like, I don't know, I'm ever going to live life ever again. And then we go through the Shiva process, we go through the 30 days, and we go through the year in a healthy way, as we spoke about in our course, Journey of the Soul, which we did in the winter, I think it was, right? And then the nature of the world is that we move on. Of course, we always remember them, and on the yard, but to a certain degree, we're able to function in life again, we move on. But when a person hasn't passed away, right, such as the case of Joseph, we have a very, very hard time moving on. And I think it's extremely telling that thousands of years after the destruction of Jerusalem, of the temple in Jerusalem, and thousands of years after Jews have been exiled from the land of Israel, Jerusalem and the temple are still very much alive in our hearts. And we eagerly wait. Every single year we spend 3 weeks mourning and waiting for the land of Israel to return to us, right? Properly, and its full glory, and the temple and everything in Jerusalem, right? Which leads us to the final text of our course. Every single day we pray multiple times per day. In every single Jewish prayer it's mentioned. At every single Jewish occasion it's mentioned. We went through this at length in just our last course. What was it called? This Can Happen. All about Mashiach. Every single day we wait for that day. We say, may our eyes get to see again when the temple comes back. That time of Mashiach, which Maimonides describes in text 18. Lon, why don't you bring it home for us? Go for it. Lon, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Of course I'm muted. A king from the house of David will arise, who studies Torah and fulfills its commandments like David his father, in accordance with both the written and oral Torah. And he will compel all of Israel to walk in its ways and repair its breaches. And he will fight the battles of God. If he does the above and is successful, and he builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel to the land of Israel, then he is definitely the Mashiach. He will then improve the entire world to serve God in unison. In that time, there will not be hunger or war, nor envy or competition, for good will flow in abundance, and all the delights will be freely available as dust. The occupation of the entire world will be solely to know God, as it is written, for the world will be filled with the knowledge of God as waters cover the seabed.
May it be speedily in our days. Amen.
Amen.
Let's turn our attention to the video screens for a summary of this lesson, and then I have a little bit of housekeeping announcements to make right after the course.
Lesson 6. A nation that dwells alone. 1. Israel faces constant pressure and criticism in the international arena. While reasonable criticism is welcomed, many believe that Israel's treatment at the United Nations and by international media coverage is neither fair nor objective. 2. Anti-Semitism has been a historic constant, and it flourishes today too. Many theories have been suggested to explain the causes of anti-Semitism. For example, the Jewish conviction of being the chosen nation, the belief that Jews control the economy, and Christian or Islamic theology. But none of these reasons hold up to scrutiny. 3. Historically, Jews have tried to deal with anti-Semitism either by assimilating or trying to find some sort of autonomy. Neither of these approaches has found lasting success. 4. There are several indicators that anti-Israel sentiment is simply a new form of anti-Semitism. As such, no true underlying cause can be found, and no change of lifestyle, conduct, or faith will solve the issue. 5. The survival of the Jewish nation is not natural. It is due to repeated divine intervention. When we rely on God, His protection is there for us to a far greater degree. Donning tefillin by everyone, but especially the IDF soldiers, provides Israel with an added measure of divine protection. 6. Israel is not self-sufficient in terms of water supply and is reliant on rainfall. This is God's way of reminding us that our true security comes from Him in all areas of life, society, and governance. 7. The same God in whom we place our complete trust told us to be mindful of our ties with other nations, to maintain polite and respectful relationships. 8. Israel can't disengage from the world because it is her duty to provide the world with an example of a meaningful life of holiness, positive productivity, etc. Israel's disproportionate positive contributions to the world open the doors for her moral and spiritual message to be heard around the globe.
Thank you all for joining us for Lesson 6 of Survival of a Nation. And with this, we conclude our course. It has been a tremendous honor and a privilege for me to teach you all over these past 6 weeks. I hope that you have felt the same way. I hope you have found this course to be meaningful and to be helpful and to be enlightening. A couple of end notes before we say goodbye. I'm going to leave this in the recording like that. Those that are watching afterwards can let me know the same. Number one, as I mentioned many times throughout this course, we are going to be doing a trip as a follow-up to this course, a community trip to the land of Israel. It's scheduled for March of 2022. I know that many of you are worried in terms of COVID. I know that many of you are concerned possibly with other concerns, whether it's price or things like that. And I would like to invite you, if you have serious interest in joining this trip, to join me for a Zoom meeting. There is no date scheduled yet, but once I have everybody that is interested, I will schedule a date, probably on a Sunday morning, like that, or a Sunday evening, in other words, not to take away a Sunday, for half an hour, so that I can go through the trip briefly, take questions from everyone, and also that those that are actually interested in the trip can meet the others that are interested in it, etc. I'd like to schedule such a Zoom. So if you have any interest whatsoever in this trip, and maybe your concern is COVID, or maybe your concern is finances, or maybe your concern is just Israel, maybe your concern is security, hopefully not at this point, because we established that Israel is the safest place in the world. But if you have any concern like that, I invite you to come and we'll address those and we'll talk about those. You can ask questions, etc. So all you need to do is to text me that you have interest in the Land and Spirit trip, and then I will reach out, we'll be in touch, and we'll arrange a date that works for everyone. Okay, so all you need to do is text me. So whether it's somebody on this Zoom now or someone that's watching the recording, please text me, and we'll make sure you get that. Number one. Number two, the upcoming course on October 25th, which again I mentioned a few times today, is scheduled for October 25th, and it's a 4-week course, and it's called Outsmarting Anti-Semitism. Don't worry, this is not the last time you'll hear about it from me, but it is the first time. You'll get my brochures in the mail, you'll get my emails, and you got my first email yesterday. However, I do want to inform people that have been attending this course that there is a special discount available. As I mentioned in the middle, $10 off per student, which means if you're a couple, it's $20 off. If you're an individual, it's $10 off. You do need a discount code, and I will be sending that out in the follow-up email to this. Actually, probably not in the same follow-up email to this lesson. I'll send a separate email inviting you to the next course for people that are in this course, and that's called Outsmarting Anti-Semitism. As a pitch for that course, I wanted to do one thing, which I think will be extremely helpful. I want to tell you what this course is not. Okay, and I mentioned that in the middle, but let me do that right now. This course is not learning about anti-Semites and their views. This course is not designed to make people worried or afraid. This course is not designed to go through the history of anti-Semitism against the Jewish people. As an extension of that, this course is not to tell a sob story of the Jewish people. Our people have been through so much. We're not going to be talking about that. And our course is specifically, probably most importantly, not about redefining Judaism as being anti-Semitic. In other words, turning anti-Semitism into the sole focus. I'm aware that there are a lot of Jewish organizations that exist only because of anti-Semitism, only to fight anti-Semitism. That none of these are the goals of this course. So what, you're like, well, how can you have a course about anti-Semitism and not talk about that? This course is meant to talk about our personal approach when anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States. Again, it's not going to be to convince you that it is on the rise. Whatever your belief about that is, the course will address specifically how we can minimize our anxiety, how we can fight it with optimism, with positivity, and recognizing what we're in control of, what we're not in control of, and how to deal with those situations. We're going to talk about things like Trachgut Vetzeingut, which means having a positive approach at life and creating positive vibes in the world that we live in, while at the same time not burying our head in the sand. We'll talk about pragmatic approaches of what we can do to address anti-Semites in individuals who we know who may have certain anti-Semitic tendencies, etc., and when we can't do anything about it and how to deal with that. That is the goal of this course. And I think that you will all find it extremely helpful in your lives. So I encourage you all to join us. Again, it starts October 25th. You already have the registration link in your email. All you need is the discount code for having attended this course, and I will send that out, God willing, tonight.